writing panel. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is a combination of writing about history, writing YA fiction and historical fiction. And then, we can also talk a lot about different ways into publishing, different ways of getting, your book out there, because there's a lot of great knowledge between the three of us that we can share. So really glad to have you all here tonight. My name is Bethanne Patrick, and I'm a board member for 1455 Lit Arts, and couldn't have a more wonderful honor. It's really exciting to me to see our inaugural literary festival doing so well. Yay! Woo! Sean Murphy! Yes! Woo-hoo! I've been looking at all of the photos on Instagram, watching everyone down to a dull roar! I might lose my voice tonight. So, I tweet as the Book Maven, and you can find me there. I also created a hashtag called Friday Reads that's all over social media. It's a way of sharing what you're reading each week. I'm also an author and a writer. I've written a couple of books for National Geographic, and I'm working on a memoir for the Counterpoint Press right now. So definitely when we get to the part where we're talking about publishing and writing, I am happy to share. But because we're really here about young adult literature, I'm going to introduce my two fantastic panelists. And I'm so excited. This was serendipity, total serendipity. I did an amazing interview for the Historical Novel Society of North America with Jeff Shara. I'm sure you're all familiar with Jeff and his father Michael's work, and with Dolan Perkins Valdez, who's a DC novelist, author of Lynch and Baum. And it was an amazing interview, and no one ever wants to talk to the moderator or the interviewer. But when we were finished, a woman came up to me and said, "I want to talk to you," and I thought, yes. So I'm going to introduce first Libby Carter McNamee. If I'm saying,
that's okay.
Perhaps McNamee?
No, it's McNamee. On my second date, I pronounced it McNamee. So
there you go.
I can never get annoyed with
So Libby is a writer and a lawyer who loves exploring America's many historical sites. But when a descendant of Susanna Bowling, and you'll hear more about her in a moment, told Libby about her ancestors' heroism, Libby was determined to share it with the world. And so Susanna's Midnight Ride is her first published novel, and that is with Sagebrush Press.
Right.
She served as a U.S. Army JAG officer, and I'm going to give her a big shout out because my husband's a JAG officer, in Korea, Bosnia, Germany, and Washington State. She and her book obsessed husband and son live in Richmond, and she's a Boston native. She graduated from Georgetown University cum laude and is a Catholic University Law School graduate as well. So welcome, Libby.
Thank
you for being here.
Very kind introduction.
And along with Libby, we have Jayda Justus. I'm just delighted to have Jayda here because she offers a completely different kind of experience. She's working on a novel for adults, as we say, and I love that when you say adult publishing, it sounds so naughty, but it just means a regular book for grown-ups. And she is a writer and blogger. She blogs at The History Mom, where she reviews historical sites and experiences for families, and we're going to talk about that more. They provide tips and reading lists to enhance visits for children and families, encouraging parents to make history sightseeing part of their experience on vacation. She's originally from Kings Mountain, North Carolina. You're heading to Grundy, right, you said? And lives in the Richmond area with her family. Before she moved to Richmond, she worked as legislative director for Representative Sue Myrick on Capitol Hill, majoring in history and political science. Before that at Furman, and she's working on her historical fiction book set in Richmond during the Civil War. So Jayda, welcome as well. Thank you both of you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Well, the first thing I want to ask you both, and this is a big question, but I think it's really perfect for our audience. How do we define young adult literature? And Jayda, for you, I know you're not writing YA literature, but you know a lot about it and have resources about it. So let's talk a little bit about middle grade and YA literature and what makes it different from children's lit and from adult lit.
Sure. Well, I have a 14-year-old son too, so I'm kind of in that. I'm also seeing it from a parent with a child reading in that genre perspective. So to me, middle grade is very relatable to the kids. YA has become, as we were talking about a little bit earlier, a little bit more edgy. And so as a parent of a 14, almost 15-year-old, that's kind of, I feel like, the line right there, where they're getting into high school, maybe young adult is kind of more what they're looking for. Middle grade is more what they've grown up with, for me.
Okay, and what do you think? How do you define it, Libby?
I actually went and talked to one of my local booksellers. It's called the Little Bookshop in Midlothian, right outside of Richmond. And she was saying that
Indies.
Yeah, a great bookshop, and so is this one. She was saying it's YA is defined as anything like 12 and up, 13 and up, 14 and up, and but a lot of times that YA deals with social issues. And when you think about it, a lot of the times it is attacking, or addressing, kind of the hate you give, that kind of thing, controversial. But what I've been told about the difference between middle grade and YA is middle grade, the parents are there. YA, they're out of the picture, and it's just the kids. And when you look at the writing, you can see they always find a way to get rid of the parents.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah.
In young adult literature, the parents are working,
Yes,
or the parents they've gone on extended sabbatical
Exactly.
somewhere.
Yeah.
It's really quite interesting, and I think a lot of people don't realize that is one of the things about YA literature is the teenagers themselves, the young people themselves come to the fore, and in YA literature they have to make some real decisions. Decisions that are important, so that is now with YA lit, we move, since you both write about history, what is it that makes historical fiction so perfect for YA literature? Is that a fair question?
Oh, sure. Well, I just think it's a great way, I call it like passive learning with historical fiction. Of you're into the story, but you're learning all this history, and you don't realize that you are. And what I learned, I used to think history was boring, and I had no interest.
Raise your hand if you ever.
I said, remember when you used to think history was boring? Like, I would go to Colonial Williamsburg, and I would go to the outlets. And he would joke, like, there is that Duke of Gloucester Street. And look what I got. And, but it's funny, I started writing these articles when my son was little, Traveling with Kids article for a Richmond Parents Monthly. And then we were going on these historical things, and I'm like, oh God, I have to pay attention because I gotta write this article. And once I started paying attention, and it was so interesting. And the more you know, the more interesting it gets, because I say it's like having like hooks on the wall. Like if you don't have any hooks on the wall, you try to hang your clothes on it, they fall to the floor. But once you have a little hook of like, oh, okay, and then it gets even more and more interesting. And what I think is so neat is realizing that all these people in history, they're people, and they've got their quirks, and like even our founding fathers, like I'm working on a book on Dolly Madison in the War of 1812. Thomas Jefferson was a redhead. He stammered. His only public speeches that he made as president were his inaugural addresses. They were completely inaudible. No one could hear him. And even his State of the Union, he would mail them.
Had a lot of quirks.
Yeah,
Our Jefferson.
but it's just so interesting. And he was tall and lanky and thin, and James Madison was 5'4" and 100 pounds soaking wet. And so it's like all that little stuff.
Great little
and it's just like, but it's just realizing they're, just getting to know them as people, and you realize, we are a product of our history, and that expression, if you don't learn from history, you're deemed to repeat it. But so that's why I've picked the genre, is I love to touch into these kids at the age 12 and get them interested in history instead of me getting interested in history in like my late 40s. And I think I wish I had untapped this interest so much when I was so much younger.
That is such a good point, and Jayda, I want to make sure we get to you in a second, but I just want to say that when I taught for a very short time social studies at the middle school and high school level, I remember I loved my 7th and 8th graders because they were still willing to get excited about things before they thought it was totally uncool. Now that may have changed, maybe now it's down to the 4th and 5th graders. But the point about that is you can, through fiction, really excite someone about an event, about a place, about a person. So your thoughts on that, history and YA, and well, actually history and fiction altogether.
Right, well, I've seen in my own children, and that's kind of like the tagline of my blog is making history your story. If you can personalize it and be able to relate to what, where you're going on vacation, or just, it's not just facts and figures with history, allowing kids to see through fiction, through the I Survive series, or A Ranger in Time, where it's a fun way for them to learn, and then they go and they stand in those spots and know that real children like them live through that too. I think that's the best way to learn history. They remember those rather than, what date something happened. I think that's why a lot of people think history is boring, because they think it's just dates, and who cares about those dates? It's really stories and what people went through, and it's just telling people stories. And so if you learn the stories, then I think the facts kind of follow along.
And then once you learn the stories, also the objects and the places, and the molding on the walls, and all. Instead of being just something that is incredibly boring to look at, it becomes something that, oh, maybe this played a part. And there's a lot of that in Susanna's Midnight Ride. A lot of, it's clear that you did a great deal of research.
Yes,
and
it was a procrastination tool.
That's, yes, very, very true. But you have things, everything from looking under a dresser and finding something that's got dust bunnies on it, to the brick-lined tunnels that would go from an estate, or maybe not a plantation house, but a manor house, to the kitchens, and that were always cool, in the summer. And on one hand, that tells us a lot about enslaved peoples in Virginia. On the other hand, it also tells us a lot about children's lives, and children who were not so busy ordering people around, but who were busy, being parented by house servants and enslaved peoples. So it's really interesting to me. And where did you find the balance between Susanna, her family, and the people who served them, the people that they owned?
Well, when I first started the story, I honestly, when I first started this, if someone said what country helped us win the American Revolution, I probably would have said France, I think. And then I started doing the research, and then I got so sucked into the research that it was kind of like, okay, I need to make this a story, because I was able to corroborate her story of what she had done as true, but I couldn't write it as nonfiction. So just, all that, so then I really had to,
Wait, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No.
why couldn't you write it as nonfiction?
because I basically didn't have enough facts about her.
That's a very interesting point. This is why sometimes fiction can really lift up and expand something that's going
And
on.
also, about 6 months into it, I realized, oh my gosh, these people had slaves. Like, I don't want to deal with this issue. And then it was like, all right, suck it up.
Got it.
And then it was, and that was just really enlightening, because, my own, bias, I think of, Underground Railroad and Get to the North, and it's like, back then it was against the law to free your slaves, and all 13 colonies had slavery. So even if you ran away, there was nowhere to go. You had no money.
This is not the Civil War. This is the
Yeah,
Revolutionary War.
But it was really
Completely
eye-opening
different,
of like, oh my gosh, these people were unbelievably trapped in this, horrific situation. So, so then I did a lot of names of, even their names, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was, a popular name back then, but, kind of, I felt that like fit with their personality. But what I did was I found, because there's no records, because they weren't considered people, they were chattel, so there's no records of, and one of the nicest compliments is I had an agent ask me once, she said, Penny's not real? And that was Susanna's, and I said,
Penny is the house servant.
for Susanna, and I said, no, and I said, there's no information, and she said, oh, like she just had this sad thing, and I was like, it made me feel so good that I created a vibrant character that she was disappointed that she wasn't real. But what I did was I did a lot of research on kind of famous slaves, and like Big Hank is modeled after someone, and all of them kind of have like a predecessor, or some of the comments that they have in there where they say to Susanna, you better, you're too nice to your slave, you're gonna spoil her. Well, that, I actually found that in a book. So what I tried to, because I get so, we talked about it.
Primary sources.
Well, and just being so hung up on trying to keep things accurate, that, so that was kind of neat to just take them and kind of, just sort of, transfer the things over to make it accurate. But it was just very telling of just how horrific it was.
It's difficult. It's really difficult. And Jayda, can you tell us a little bit about the book you're working on, whatever you like to say, but then expand on this, because you're also writing about Richmond in a very difficult time.
Yes.
So.
And a lot about the procrastination by researching is something that I've noticed, because I love the research. Being a history major, nonfiction is more of what I'm used to writing, and so the dialogue and trying to come up with, and I want it to be so historically accurate, going down the rabbit hole of like, oh, did he really look like, did he really say things like that, this real person who might be a character in my book, but is not the main character. So it's easy to get sidetracked that way.
Are you writing about the Revolutionary War or the Civil War?
Civil War in Richmond, two sisters caught up in, because when Richmond, the soldiers all left, the women were left there, and then I'm also a part of it taking place in Hanover County. So just what the women went through. They, with all the battles raging, they could hear the battles throughout the war as it was raging around Richmond, knowing that at any minute the city could fall, and so what that did for their psyche and their kids.
Well, women are so often ignored in stories of war. I have a colleague who I hope will wind up at this festival one day, named Pamela Toller, who has written the incredibly popular series Mercy Street.
Oh, wow.
And Sisters of Mercy Street. And she is so gifted at bringing, the women's experience to the fore. And that was where I know I am not writing, well, I am writing historical fiction, but that will come after this memoir is finished, someday. But the way I got interested in all of this was growing up in the Hudson Valley, steeped in Revolutionary War history, and I didn't care about it. I didn't care about the soldiers. We would go on school field trips to the New Windsor Cantonment, where the Federal Army, the Continental Army, the Continental Army, wintered for a couple of seasons, et cetera, and all I cared about was the teeny tiny little cannons on wheels.
Oh yeah.
But then finally I learned about Margaret Corbin and the concept of Molly Pitcher, and what was going on with the women who were following their soldier spouses, through these battles and engagements in the Revolutionary War. So I have a particular interest, in what you're talking about, and it's just, we need more about it. I see all of these books coming through. I'm a professional critic, and I review books all the time, and I get more books about women during World War II now than you can possibly imagine. There's so many D-Day girls, Lilac girls, Code girls, they're all girls, right? Exactly. They're all there. And it's something, though, that I don't think can be overdone. Even if a particular season, you get too many titles, we just haven't learned enough about women's experience, have we, during engagements like that, especially the Civil War, where we focused on the male experience for so long.
The battlefield. That's one thing. If you're in Richmond, the new American Civil War Museum that just opened in May really looks at it from, I just reviewed it this past week on my blog, and it really looks at it from all perspectives. What women were going through, what children were going through, what the enslaved persons were going through, all, not just about this battle, this happened this, and here's a cannonball from that battle. They even had like a doll that a little girl was used to carry medicine across the lines. She smuggled it across the lines in her doll, and they have that doll there. So it's really things like that you can bring your child to and say, look, they lived through this too, and that gives a lot of conversation started with your children over what would you do during this time, or how would you feel if this happened to your city?
Would you put a coded message in your transcript?
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
I mean, this is the kind of thing that I always ask my.
It's your
my
Paw
adult-
Patrol.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
right. You
Right,
know,
because that's what they were doing.
you know, put a little
Yeah.
coded message on your Pokemon cards. Those are probably really old now. You know, one of the things I know, Jayda, that you have with your blog that is, but both of you have to talk about are some resources for people who want to learn more about YA historical fiction and perhaps also for history for families, etc. And so I want to make sure to let you share whatever you're interested in talking about, but know that we'll also figure out a way to put those up on the 1455 site so that you have some resources to turn to after the festival is gone, because boo-hoo, we can only have it once a year right now. But, you know, are there some that you think are particularly powerful?
Well, I do. So on the blog, with kids, I really think you get them some books beforehand and after. It really enhances their visits while they're there, and then afterwards to kind of remember what was happening. So I break out books by 14 and up, 10 and up, and 6 and up. So there are picture books that you can buy, all the way up to the young adult novels that I've found some really great. Anne Rinaldi writes a lot of historical fiction young adult novels, and I've read several of her books, and they're great resources. My kids love The Hazardous Tales by Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales, and those are graphic novels. So if you have a reluctant reader,
Very cool.
or someone that doesn't really want to sit down and read a book, but these are they're wonderful, and they have all the historical knowledge that you could want. And my son, sometimes we'll be on a tour and he'll raise his hand and say, well, that actually happened, because he knows from the Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales the actual facts. So those are some great resources. We love the I Survive series. We love the Ranger in Time, which is a time-traveling doll who goes back to the Oregon Trail or to D-Day, and it really helps kids understand these things that are just too big for adults to even understand. It really brings it home to them. And then there's so many podcasts that we listen to that can provide you
Really,
lots
for
of
kids as well?
well, for their parents to have lists. The Read Aloud Revival is a great podcast. She actually has some books. She really believes in reading aloud to your children all the way through, like even teenagers. And so she lists a lot of resources in her books and on her podcast that's weekly. Gretchen Rubin, who's a wonderful podcaster.
She's fabulous.
She's big into children's literature, and so on her website she lists like the top 100 children's literature books.
She's the author of The Happiness Project and several other books whose titles I can't remember now. She's terrific.
And there's a podcast called Currently Reading, and there is two moms talking, and a lot of times they bring in a lot of YA. They read a lot of YA. So if you're looking particularly for YA, Currently Reading is a great resource.
Fantastic. Those are really helpful. How about you? Do you have specific ones that you?
Well, I'm kind of a award snob, you know, kind of like, you know, Caldecott or Michael Prince or Loretta Scott Key, Newberry, but and I love to read, so if you don't mind, I might start reading this book. I just cannot put down. It's YA. It's called Fangirl. And
Rainbow Roll.
Oh my gosh! Seriously, I was like, I wonder if I could drive to Winchester and read this book. I mean, yeah. And my husband's like, pace yourself. Okay. So, but I have like, you know, so all those, you know, Book List, Kirkus, you know, Publishers Weekly, all that kind of stuff, and even, you know, get on like Goodreads. They have lists, and even Amazon. If you
Goodreads lists are fantastic.
They're amazing, and the reviews, because people are, you know, people who, they're real readers, and that's the thing, is getting real, you know, the real readers. Let's see, I've made a list of some of the ones I've really loved. Meg Medina, who just won was the Newbery, right? Her Yaki Delgado wants to kick your behind, and burn baby burn. She's from Richmond. She's amazing, but Girl in the Blue Coat, it's another, it's a World War II story that's fabulous, and I love, like, My Brother Sam is Dead, Johnny Tremaine.
Johnny Tremaine.
Yeah, that's a great one.
I had such a crush on Johnny Tremaine.
When I was pitching my book,
When
when I was pitching my book, I said, you know, think like girl Johnny Tremaine without the burnt hand. That didn't go very well. And then Alan Gratz is fabulous. He writes, he wrote this Project 1065, which, oh my gosh, it's one of the best books I've ever read. And it's Irish boy who his father's a diplomat in Berlin, and Ireland stays neutral during the war, but of course England's at war with Germany, so he basically becomes a spy. It is amazing.
Oh, I need to read that.
Yeah, it's Project 1065, but he also wrote this Prisoner B 3087 in Refugee, and he actually came to our son's middle school last year. The Book Thief. There's
Yes.
also a great one. I mean, we're talking about World War II overkill, but if you can find a new angle on it, you know, this Making Bombs for Hitler.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Really good.
Oh my god. Did you read that? Oh my gosh, that was amazing.
And to bring it back to the
Yeah,
Revolutionary
yeah,
War for a
yeah.
second, so I was talking about the things that started interesting me with Margaret Corbin and Molly Pitcher, but because I lived right across the river from Connecticut, you already know this, Libby,
Yeah.
the person who really captured my imagination was a young girl, 14-year-old, named Sybil Ludington, who made a midnight ride from Danbury, Connecticut to Putnam County, New York. And so I want to make sure that we talk about Susanna's midnight ride for a second, so you can say, talk about what, without spoilers necessarily, what Susanna did, and it really was crucial to the Revolutionary War, what this 16-year-old girl did in Virginia. So tell us a little bit about her.
She was living on her family's plantation in Virginia, which had seen no action during the war. So, I have it portrayed that, and her three brothers were off fighting in the war, that she really wishes she was in on the action and she wants to be doing something instead of sewing and doing chores. And lo and behold, out of nowhere, General Cornwallis shows up with this entire British Southern Army. And he had broken out of North Carolina against orders from the head general, General Clinton. So basically, he came marching into her front yard, and they had no idea, absolutely no warning whatsoever that he was even in Virginia. And that night, as she was serving dinner, she overheard his plans. They talked about capturing the boy, which is what they called Lafayette, because he was 19 years old when he came over. So
at this point in the war, he's only 23. Lafayette
yes,
is only 20.
yeah.
Really unbelievable.
But really, at this point in the war, it was late May 1781, and the French were subsidizing everything, like uniforms, ships, everything was, everything was coming from the French and all the money. So if Lafayette was caught, then Louis XVI was going to cut it off because he really didn't want to be. Lafayette had talked him into it. Plus, it would have been so demoralizing because everyone loved Lafayette, and he was like General Washington's adopted son, and they were just hanging on by I say like a French thread, and then after doing all the research, and I even saw this in a couple of books of people joking, the men would have loved to have given up, but they were afraid to go home and face their wives. And these women were so feisty. So when I do school visits, I say, can you imagine your mother without coffee for 10 years? The kids are like, it's like mayhem.
That is so great. I'm going to use that. So I'm stealing that from you because if Susanna hadn't been brave enough to saddle up and ride and go canoe across the Appomattox
In the pitch dark,
alone.
with 1,000 soldiers sleeping on her
Yeah,
lawn.
and then get on her horse and make a 20-mile ride.
Yeah.
For want of a horse, the whole war could have been lost.
Really,
to paraphrase.
and because that was late May 1781, and then Lafayette started playing cat and mouse with Cornwallis, and then trapped him in Yorktown by August. So it's like the Battle of Yorktown never would have happened.
Right.
So in Petersburg, they call it the girl who won the Revolutionary War, and that's why I put that as the byline on there.
She really is, that important. And yet, has anyone here heard of her before today?
In the book I have over there that's called Little Stories from the American Revolution, they say on there, everybody remember Susanna Bowling? That's okay, hardly anybody does today. But for some reason, I don't know whether it was not considered ladylike or whatever, but it got buried.
Because history textbooks were written.
Yeah. And I always like to say, Paul Revere got caught, and Susanna Bowling did not.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Go, Susanna. Really, I want to make sure that we have time. We're supposed to end at 7:15, and I want to have time for questions. But we can also talk a lot about publishing. publishing and, different paths. So, do we have questions?
So how did you find Susanna? Did you know of her?
I actually ended up, I met someone who was married to her descendant, and he said, oh, you've got to write this book, I heard you're a writer, and then he kind of steered me in the direction of, so yeah, it's just amazing.
What a wonderful.
And it was at a funeral. I mean,
Well, that's where you talk about descendants, isn't it?
yeah, that's true.
And I loved your afterword when you're talking about, the connection between Susanna and Pocahontas. There is one. It's not quite as direct as you might, as I might wish it to be.
Exactly.
But it's still really interesting. I loved
Pocahontas
how
was like her step-great-great-grandmother.
It's great, though. I mean, it just shows, in America, we're not that many generations removed from anything.
Yeah.
And we forget that. We think it's so long ago, but it's really, it's closer in our bloodlines than we believe. Other questions? Yeah.
Libby, you had to do kind of double duty when you were writing Susanna's voice. One was to get to the head of a teenager, and then another was to think of how a teenager from 1780, whatever, how she would have viewed the world. That's kind of two steps removed. How did you do that? How did you prep for that?
It was hard, but I'm very young at heart, so a lot of her personality, her kind of like not domestic and kind of impulsive, like that's me. But what's interesting was I first wrote the book, I wrote it in third person, and then I hired an editor in Charlottesville, and she was wonderful until she told me, you need to rewrite this in first person because it's awkward, because we can't tell. And then I thought, I don't like you anymore. And then I was like, she's right. So then I went through and I redid it, and it made it so much easier to get into her head than if you're looking at her, kind of objectively. So it just, it took me a long time, really. I mean, but really switching from the third person to the first person made a really big difference. And a lot of it too, how I kind of tend to work in layers, and I go through and kind of think, okay, how do I add the 5 senses into this? Like, where do I have a sense of smell or touch or taste, that kind of thing. So I kind of would go through the whole manuscript and try to add those layers in and make it more relatable.
But what about, and I think this goes to your question about learning how a teenager spoke in that era.
I did a ton of rabbit hole research of like revolutionary slang, and I did actually a lot of like thesaurus of like, what, instead of look up small, and it's like what's a more of a colonial sounding word to, for small, and now I can't even remember what but I did. I know. It was funny. I had the word "we" in there at one point. My friend's like, "Is she Irish?" I'm like, "Oh, we's going out. That's the end of we." So I just did a ton of research. Really, it was just research. I mean, I had ordered all these books, and I did a lot of research at Library of Virginia and that kind of thing. But a lot of it was just reading. I read, Avi, Sophia's War, and Johnny Tremaine, and all that, but yeah, it was just reading, just getting your hands on as many different things, like each book has a little bit of a different spin or that kind of thing, and then I had an editor go through it, and it turned out it was hilarious. She was British, so I emailed it to her in, London, and then there were a couple of things she was like, oh, we didn't really say that till later on, and things that she told me,
Oh, that's great, though, to get the across the pond perspective.
Well, it's also just good to get a great editor who, that makes such a huge difference. But yeah, it took a lot, because it's also, you don't want it to be like, even with the slave dialect, it's like, you don't want to seem like racist or like that they're dumb, and someone said, just one little thing is, like in a sentence, goes a long way. You don't need it all broken English to convey that. So that I tried to do too, is just a little bit, and you get the hint, of just, there's a different dialect going on.
Yeah, there's a different way of communicating.
Yeah.
And it was, completely to acknowledge it.
Yes, and a lot too is with, Susanna's slave Penny, I tried to make it that Penny was very smart, and a lot of times was much more level-headed than Susanna.
Absolutely.
So that, I wanted it to be that way, of having it, and that's what one of the agents said to me, well, I like that they're equals,
Yes.
they're, not social equals, but they're, they complement each other, and they're kind of a team, as opposed to, because that's the other thing too, is like, the whole slavery issues, you don't want to be like, you don't want it to be horrible and they're abusing their slaves. Like, I don't want to read that. I don't want to write about that. But it's also, you don't want to sugarcoat it for these people that were slaves, that were treated horribly. And it's not fair to them to sugarcoat it and pretend it was kumbaya and everybody was a big happy family.
Well, it's a very, very big and delicate issue. I know, Jayda, that you were also going to have to deal with this in writing about the Civil War and women, and because these women were supported by various enslaved members of their households. And sometimes that was someone who was given almost equal status, sometimes it wasn't, and women aren't always all sweetness and light either. We have a lot of problems in the Me Too era with men, but it's not as if the women in these households were always, I must treat, the staff so well. No,
Have another scone.
Yeah, no, that's not realistic either. So how are you approaching this issue?
I'm trying to do a lot of really primary source research. A lot of it with the Civil War, there are a lot of diaries that are out there, and so actually looking at a lot of Mary Boykin Chestnut is one of my favorite.
Oh, yes.
Because she kind of was everywhere that something was happening in the Civil War. She was there. She was in Charleston watching from the hotel, from the top of the roof, about Fort Sumter being bombed, and then she was in Richmond, and she was good friends with Brina Davis. So those kind of first-hand resources, I think, are your best. But that really has the language that they've spoken, and then what really happened.
If they were telling the truth.
Well, Mary Boykin Chestnut, she's very sassy, so you
Mary
really get
Chestnut's Civil War is
Oh
a
my gosh.
fantastic.
Yes.
It's a fantastic read, whether or not you are doing some writing of your own. It's just, it is very real, and she was extremely honest on the page.
And she was in the Ken Burns thing.
Yes.
And he quotes her all the time.
Yes. She's
Mary
like the most
Chestnut.
well-known, but there are so many, even while I was here in Winchester, seeing the diaries that they have available here of the women who were in Winchester when it was switching back and forth from Union to Confederate hands. I think it said in the museum 70 times.
Oh my gosh,
This
so
town,
amazing.
72.
Isn't that incredible?
Yeah,
72.
So just think of what the women whose house was here, and they would see one army flee and another 10
And
minutes
different
later
flag.
coming.
Yeah.
And so what that did to them. So.
It's amazing.
72 times?
Yes.
Did anyone else know that?
I went to that museum.
Yeah.
I went to that museum in December, and I was like
I
flabbergasted.
should have said non-Winchester.
I was gonna say.
Lecture series down at Godfrey Miller in honor of the 275th year.
Oh wow.
And so we had a speaker from the Shenandoah Valley, what's that?
Battlefield
Association.
Uh-huh.
And so he said there's been controversy over the years. Was it 62? Was
Oh
it
my gosh.
That's
Was it
fascinating.
70? And they've confirmed 72.
Wow.
So you can read the diary of the ladies who lived here, and that's the
Exactly.
That's
best primary
awesome.
source you could imagine.
Yeah.
I would like to read a novel. Someone write a novel
That's
about
what
it.
I've
Thank you.
I've got that idea tucked in the back of my head. I think that'd make a great novel. And they brought these women were so feisty, and they were Confederate, so that sometimes the Union guys would bring them like 10 miles outside of town and just dump them off. And then the women would walk back.
You have to be feisty to survive something.
Oh my gosh, I
And
can
he
imagine.
told us about one woman of Winchester, the Union was coming in. Everybody knew they were coming. And as one of the generals was leaving town, a woman stopped him. And she came out with a tray with tea to give it to him because she said, I'm afraid you'll be the last Confederate soldier I'll ever see. So.
Wow.
And then another time women lined across the street, what was it, Cameron Street?
He didn't have names, but
Yeah.
so it was a nice story, yeah.
Oh, wow.
But there were Unionists who lived in Winchester throughout the Civil War, so
Oh,
people
wow.
women were living side by side with different political, so it'd be a great novel.
Oh, yeah.
That
yeah.
is absolutely
Yeah,
fascinating, right next door.
Right,
The
right.
Unionist next
Right,
door.
yeah, worried about.
Well, that's a great
Your
title.
kids. Very
Yeah, I
well.
think it'd be a
It would be
great adult novel or, yeah.
It
yeah.
really, really would.
Mhm.
That's absolutely fascinating.
Mhm.
It is.
Has he written anything? Kevin Walker?
No. He's too busy running.
Other questions?
Any issues with finding publishers? Are publishers really hot on getting YA authors, or are they more difficult to?
Publishers, I spent a long time looking for an agent, and it's just a long process, and they'll say, oh, I like the first 50 pages, can I have the rest of it? And then 4 months later, you get a form letter that says, this doesn't suit our needs. So I had a complete stranger who lives in Austin, Texas. I lecture me on the phone of just get it out there, and he even used swear words. And my husband's like, I've been telling you that for like 2 years. So I ended up self-publishing a year ago, and for me, it's been fantastic because I was able to hire.
So Sagebrush is a
Sagebrush Press is me. So.
Okay. Because I was going to say there are so many different ways to publish
Yes,
now.
yeah.
There's traditional publishing, and then there's self-publishing, and there's also hybrid publishing.
Yeah.
And then, another form that is known as vanity publishing, but some people want that. So Sagebrush
Yes.
Press is you.
Yes.
And you completely put it together. So.
Yeah, and then I was able to hire my own, my own agents, my own editors, my own proofreader, and it's neat of like they were talking about at the panel earlier today of like, you don't even have, with a traditional publisher, you don't even control your title.
Right.
So it's kind of neat, and then it's also, if I'm gonna have to do all my own publicity anyway, which is the state of,
But this is a great cover, and one of the things I said to Libby when we met is that I was really impressed by it because I see so many self-published books that have terrible, terrible covers. And you're never, here's the thing, I'm so glad I'm able to bring Jayda and Libby here as panelists. You're never gonna have someone like me, I'm a columnist for the Washington Post, I review for Time Magazine, I review for NPR, etc. I am never going to review a self-published book, and that is not because there aren't good self-published books. And I just want to underscore that. It's because there are too many of them.
yes.
And there's got to be a funnel somewhere. So when it comes to, anyone whose name you know is a critic, Carlos Lozada, Maureen Corrigan, Ron Charles, Dwight Garner at the New York Times, none of us is ever, ever, ever going to review your self-published book of any kind. And it is not, again, because we don't respect you, admire you, even sometimes we think your book is fantastic, but there's just too many.
And there's no quality control.
Yeah, and there's no quality
yeah,
control.
yeah.
And what Libby just said, and Jayda, I want to talk to you about this in a second too, is Libby is, working with an editor, working with a copy editor, proofreader, designer, all this stuff. That's what people are doing now. And I just want to make sure if there's anyone who does think about self-publishing in the audience, because it is a totally valid way and probably a more lucrative way of publishing. We could talk about that.
Yes,
Is that if you're thinking about that, it's no longer, here's what I've written, throw it between two covers. The real self-publishing or indie publishing, if you prefer, success stories now are people who know that they need help. They need an editor, they need a designer, they need a marketer. So you cannot do it all yourself, whether you go traditional publishing or self-publishing. And so with that, I wanted to ask you, Jayda, and then we'll probably have to end and go back to Revelry. But are you going to be self-publishing your novel? What do you think?
I'm not sure yet, so I'm not quite there yet. So we're gonna just have to see how it works. But I've had such great friendships that I feel like, and then in Richmond we have the great James River writers, and they bring in agents every. So I've met with agents before those conferences. So I'd encourage, if you are a writer, find those conferences where
We're going to be doing that with 1455.
Yes, so that's
Absolutely.
great. Yeah, just bringing in those agents and kind of getting your name out there and figuring out what you want to do with your book.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's nice though that they're, it used to be self-published and people are just like, oh, and now you know, that, and I have a friend he's been very successful. He quit his regular job, self-published these books. They're called the Virginia Mysteries, and they're for about a 4th grade reading level, and they're fabulous. But he just was like, basically said, Libby, don't cheap out. Like, just so, you know, I hired the big picture editor who made me switch to first person, and I hated her for a little while, but then I was grateful. And then I hired a copy editor to go line by line, and then he said, and don't skip the proofreader. So that was another $300 to have someone proofread it, and don't have your friends proofread it. You know, have someone professional. And then the cover cost me $500. And if people say don't judge a book by its cover, how can you not judge a book by its cover? It's the first thing you see.
Yeah.
So, I mean.
And there you have it, because that is what got Libby McNamee invited to the 1455 inaugural literary festival. So I just want to say thank you, Libby.
Oh, thank you.
Jayda,
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you all for being here, and thanks 1455. This is fantastic.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
And,